Welcome. I'm Dr. Gunderson. Welcome to my history class. One of the things we'll be doing in the history class is learning how to write a research paper. And rather than give this lecture 4 times, I thought I would put it in the PowerPoint and only give the lecture once. Let's talk about how to write the research paper. Now first, in trying to put together a topic, it's very difficult to come up with a topic or some kind of snappy title for the title of your paper. Now, what you don't want to do is pick a subject like World War II. If you were to pick a subject like World War II, how can you do justice to World War II in, let's say, a 4 to 12-page research paper? You can't. So what you do is you try to focus on something a bit smaller, such as the battle for the Solomon Islands, the battle for the Philippines, maybe something to that effect. Once you pretty much settle on a title, one of the best ways to get the attention of the instructor is kind of put a snappy title to it. Let's say you're doing a research paper on Bill Clinton. Would you put the title of your paper, Bill Clinton, Good or Bad President? Or would you put some snappy title like Bill Clinton, Great President or Philanderer? It's up to you. But you do want to try to get the instructor's attention with your paper. They're going to spend more time maybe focusing in on, your paper as a good paper rather than something that might be lackluster. Now, once you have your topic narrowed down, then you have to start thinking about what are going to be the sub-themes of your paper. Now, let's say, for example, we're going to do a paper on William Marshall. William Marshall was a knight during the High Middle Ages. He was a very successful knight, 500 career wins in the tournaments, something like that. So if you were going to write a paper on William Marshall, what would you focus in on? Well, obviously you couldn't focus in on his entire life. So what you might want to focus in on is some specific aspects of his life, such as William Marshall and the 4 kings that he served under, William Marshall's military career, William Marshall in relation to the code of chivalry. Those are the types of sub-subjects that you would want to look at for a title for your paper. Once you've settled in for a title or a subject, then you develop your thesis. The easiest way to write a thesis statement for your research paper is to begin with these simple words. The purpose of this paper is to. Now, that statement is generally going to go into the introductory / thesis paragraph. Normally what you want to do in a research paper is the first sentence of the research paper, you want to kind of familiarize the reader with the subject material that you're about to enter into. So you start out with kind of a macro view of the subject. Let's say we were going to do William Marshall. And the thesis for the William Marshall paper was going to be, the purpose of this paper is to show William Marshall's military prowess, his relationship to his wife, and his successful career in the tournaments. Well, from that point, it's very easy, you see. You take those 3 sub-subjects and you break those down and you say, well, I'm going to write 2 or 3 pages on this subject, 2 or 3 pages on that subject. And then once you write those subjects, then you come back and you link them together. But the introductory / thesis paragraph is probably the most difficult thing for a student to do, because it forces them to really be creative and to think from a macro point of view. So we're doing a paper on William Marshall. The first sentence of that research paper may begin with something like this. During the High Middle Ages, the aristocracy led society. At the bottom rung of the aristocracy were the knight-errants, or the knights attached to very successful aristocratic homes. The second sentence for that introductory / thesis paragraph may begin with something to this effect. One of the greatest knights in the High Middle Ages was William Marshall. And the reason that we know so much about William Marshall is a almost 20,000 line chanson de geste called the Chanson de Guillaume, based on his life. So those are the first 2 major sentences or 3 sentences of your introductory / thesis paragraph. And then normally the last sentence in that introductory paragraph sets out your thesis statement. The purpose of this paper is to. But you might also say something to the effect that in the next few pages, I would like to shed light upon William Marshall's life in relation to his wife, the code of chivalry, and his tournament career. That's one way of doing it. Normally, the second paragraph in the paper, if you're doing it on a person, is a brief biographical sketch. What do I mean by that? Very simple. Where was he born? How many siblings? Who was his mom and dad? A little bit about his background, or her background. That information generally does not go into that introductory / thesis paragraph, and students regularly make that same mistake. What I want students to do when they write a paper for me, introductory / thesis paragraph, short biographical sketch, or if it's an event, a short event sketch, and then you get into the meat and potatoes of the paper. So basically the first page is already written itself. 2 paragraphs, long paragraphs, 1 introductory / thesis paragraph. The second paragraph is going to be basically your summary or brief biography of that person. And then you get into the meat and potatoes. So okay, now we're at page 2. Let me also say this. Generally, the first page of a research paper is not numbered. Everyone knows that that's the first page because it's indented down a little bit further. But subsequent pages thereafter are numbered consecutively, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Okay. We're at page 2. Our subtopic for William Marshall was his relationship to his wife. Well, he had an interesting career. He had been offered one wife, he didn't want her. He wanted another one whose dad owned almost all of Ireland, and when her dad died, the property devolved to him under the laws of feudalism and the code of chivalry. So he spent about a page talking about that, or 2 pages, however long your paper is going to be. If it's 6 pages, you want 2 pages on that. If it's 10 pages, you want 3 pages on that. Then you go to your second sub-subject, talk about William Marshall in relation to the code of chivalry. And then lastly, for the last subtopic, you're going to talk about him in relation to the tournaments that he fought in. And then, of course, you write a conclusion statement. Conclusion paragraph. Now, normally your conclusion paragraph is simply a rehash of your introductory paragraph, although it's rephrased a little bit, but basically you say the same thing. And you might want to end a paper like on William Marshall by saying something like, the King of France called William Marshall God's first lieutenant on earth. And that kind of gets to the point that an English king said this, or a French king, excuse me, said this about an English knight. Not a French knight, but an English knight. And most people would understand how important that was. Now, let me talk to you about a few things within the paper itself that we need to clear up, some technical things that students generally have a problem with. First, we need to talk about quoting. After that introductory paragraph, all the way down to the end of the paper, including the conclusion paragraph, everything needs to be documented. Of course, we're using Endnotes style documentation. No footnotes, although footnotes are generally acceptable in history, not in this course, only Endnotes. Only because it's easier in Microsoft Word, and that's a whole other thing that I'm going to show you how to do. When I say that everything needs to be documented, it can be every paragraph, it can be every sentence. But let's look at something here. Your third paragraph in the paper. You're writing along. Put a period. The information came from somewhere, so you put an endnote. Keep writing, you have more information. Another period. Another endnote. Now what this means is that this endnote, this source, came from a different source than this one. Because if they came from the same sources, there would be no reason to put that endnote number there. Those 2 sentences came from the same source, you would put the endnote number here. Anyone reading that would assume that all the information in those 2 sentences came from this source. So you keep writing. You have another source that you look at. So you put an endnote there at the end of that sentence. Okay. If all of the information in that paragraph came from one source, then there's no reason to put an endnote number there. All you'll need is 1 at the end of the paragraph. And we're assuming that endnote number 1 was on the first page. Then you start a new paragraph. Endnote number. This means that the second paragraph, the second sentence in this next paragraph came from a separate source. Now, let's say, for example, you went back to the same source as number 3. You would still put an endnote number in there. Endnote numbers are used consecutively. You never use an endnote number more than once. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up till 1,000 if that's what it takes. Okay, break for a second. The next thing we need to look at are quotes or paraphrasing. Paraphrasing simply means that you have put somebody else's words into your own words. You still must endnote that information. Where did it come from? If you quote right out of a book, newspaper article, magazine, whatever, you must put quote marks around what you quoted directly. Example. First sentence here are in my words. The second sentence, however, is a direct quote. So you put quote marks at the beginning and at the end of that sentence. And by the way, the quote marks go outside the period, not inside, but outside. And then, of course, after the quotation mark, you will have the endnote number. The next sentence. Next sentence comes from a different source. But let's say that only part of that sentence is directly quoted. What you would do is put quote marks around the phrase that was directly quoted and put it into that sentence. What you don't want to do is substitute a few words in a sentence, put in a couple extra words, and call it your own work without putting the quote marks in there. Any operative clause, any operative phrase that is lifted out of a book or any other type of print media that somebody has copyright to, you must give them credit. That's what copyright's all about. So the person reading this would look and say, well, endnote number 1, they paraphrase that. Endnote number 2 is a direct quote, and you want to use direct quotes sparingly. You only use direct quotes to highlight something. And by the way, I have had students in the past turn in papers that were entirely direct quotes. And of course, they failed miserably. But then you look at endnote number 3, and endnote number 3 has some quote marks in it, but it only means that a phrase was lifted verbatim out of a publication and put in the paper. Now, long direct quotes. Long direct quotes, 4 full lines or longer, okay, 4 full lines or longer, you don't put them within the regular double-spaced text. You would single space it. Notice that this is longer than 4 full lines. It is separate and distinct from the rest of the text because I have single-spaced it. If that direct quote that is longer than 4 full lines begins at the beginning of a sentence, you indent from the automatic margin 10 spaces. Subsequent lines that are after are only indented 5 spaces. You don't put quote marks on a long direct quote. It's assumed that that is a quote. The only thing that you need to do is put in the endnote at the end. if that direct quote that is longer than 4 full lines begins somewhere in the middle of a sentence, and that of course means that this is going to be a small case letter starting that direct quote. And normally you'll have some lead-in type statement like, historians have said, comma, yada, 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 yada. If in fact you are picking up a direct quote in the middle of a sentence somewhere, the first line is indented 5 spaces, and subsequent lines thereafter within that direct quote are indented 5 spaces. And again, no quote marks are needed. Because it's single-spaced, a reader will know that that is a direct quote. On completion of your direct quote, you immediately go back to the double spacing. The next thing we're going to look at is how to do the endnote page. The endnote page comes immediately after the text pages. Normally in Microsoft it won't separate the pages. They should be separated, and the endnote pages should be numbered. The bibliographical page is not numbered. But let's look at some of the basic tenets of how to do an endnote entry. At the top of the end, the first thing that you do is you put the endnote number. Endnote number 1. That's the first time you used it. You put the author's first name first, then the author's last name, comma, title of the publication, The Flower of Chivalry, parenthesis, place of publication, colon, publisher, comma, date of publication, clothing, parenthesis, comma, page number, period. Now what that tells me is the information for endnote number 1 came from Georges Duby's book, The Flower of Chivalry, on page 93. That's easy to find. Endnote number 2 in the paper comes from Sidney Painter's book, Chivalry, printed in Boston by Brown Publishing in 1984. The information for endnote number 2 was found on page 21. You only do a complete endnote entry one time. After the complete endnote entry, you use a condensed version of the entry. Endnote number 3 is an example of this. You've given the Georges Duby entry one time, the complete entry. The next thing that you do when you use it again is you go to the condensed version, which is simply the author's last name, comma, page number, period. Now, if you are using two different books by the same author, this becomes problematic. However, it's not really a problem. If you are using 2 different books by the same author, and so as not to confuse the reader who may look at your endnotes, instead of using the author's last name after you give the complete endnote entry, you use the title of the book, comma, page number, period. The use of ibid. Ibid is Greek for, is simply, it follows. If endnote number 3 comes from the Duby book, and endnote number 4 comes from the Duby book, you don't have to put Duby, comma, page 116, period. You just put ibid, period, comma, 116, period. If endnote number 5 comes from the same source, you do it again. Ibid, period, comma, page 123, period. What that tells me is endnote number 4 and endnote number 5 come from the Georges Duby book, but on different pages. Another example. If endnote number 5 comes from the Painter book, you don't have to do the complete endnote entry again. You just simply put the author's last name, comma, the page number or numbers where you found the information, and a period. If endnote number 6 comes from the same source as endnote number 5, you would not put Painter down there again. You would put ibid, comma, or period, comma, page number, period. You do this throughout the paper. Now, at a minimum, you should use 3 scholarly sources for your research paper. A minimum of 3 scholarly sources. What are scholarly sources? Well, they're not children's books. We don't use general reference encyclopedias. You can, however, for a research paper, use a subject-specific encyclopedia, such as the Encyclopedia of African American History, the Encyclopedia of Native American History, the Encyclopedia of the Middle Ages, the Encyclopedia of Hispanic History, the Encyclopedia of Crime and Criminology in America, the Encyclopedia of Sociology. Those are the types of encyclopedias that are subject-specific that are okay, but not general reference encyclopedias like Collier's or Encarta or Encyclopedia Britannica, things of this nature. They are generally unacceptable as scholarly sources for a research paper. Again, you generally need about 3 as a minimum of sources for your research paper. Also, notice on the endnote page that the endnote numbers are superscripted above the line. They're single-spaced within the entries, double-spaced between entries. That's the way the entire thing should flow. The last thing that we need to look at, the last component of the research paper, is the bibliography page. This is basically your works cited. This is that list of the minimum of 3 sources that you have used. You need to consult Turabian's Manual for Writers, which really kind of establishes what type of format you should use for the type of publication you have. Magazine entries look different than a book by a single author. A book by 3 different authors looks different than a book by a single author. A magazine article looks different. An encyclopedia article looks different. They all have a certain format that are given to you in Kate Turabian's Manual for Writers, which you should consult. We have 3 to 5 copies here in our library. Lexington has a couple copies, and Savannah has a couple copies. But let's look at that last page, which is generally not numbered in your paper, and that is the bibliography page. At the top, like the endnote page, you should print across the top, bibliography, the endnote page, you print endnote, capital letters. Generally, you might want to bold it too. Now, you put these in alphabetical order by the author's last name first. Doobie, of course, comes first. You put Doobie's name, comma, first name, period, double space, title of publication, period. Indent the second line 5 spaces in. Where on the endnote page, the first line is indented 5 spaces. On the bibliography page, the second line and subsequent lines thereafter are indented 5 spaces. After the title of the book, in a period, you double space, you put the place of publication, colon, publisher, comma, date of publication, period. The second book that we used in this paper was written by Sidney Painter. Painter's name first, comma, first name, period, title of publication, period, underline or italicize the publication. Place of publication, colon, publisher, comma, date of publication, period. Now, if you have 2 books by the same author, you simply use 8 hyphens, period, and the title to the book. Let's just say the title of this book was Feudalism. And let's just say he's using the common publisher in Boston. Anybody reading that will know that this next publication was written by Sidney Painter. And of course, these are listed in alphabetical order by the title of the books. This, in essence, is how you write a research paper. They're going to be a little different in different places, where the English department generally uses MLA style documentation, and that is probably the style of documentation that you're familiar with. In history, the only type of documentation that we use are endnotes and footnotes. If you turn in anything other than that to me for a grade, it won't be accepted. I'll field any questions you might have in class. Thank you for your time.